One thing that every Medulr user will need to get used to is how to connect your nodes to one another and to have a basic understanding of what these connections do. As without connecting your nodes to one another, there is no way to achieve a finished material within Medulr. So let's take a bit of time to explain the basic concept of these connections, as well as going into a bit more detail about a few of the specific connection types themselves. So when it comes to connections, the first thing that we need to talk about is output connections. For every node in Medulr, there will always be an output connection, which can be found on the right hand side of nodes, such as what I'm showing you now. These connections are used for the purpose of connecting your current node to another node using the connection type that you have chosen. When you're trying to connect an output to another node, it connects to that node's inputs. A node's inputs can be located on the left hand side of a node. Inputs in Medulr will only let a connection of the same type connect to it. However, inputs have another aspect to them. Whenever you select a node within Medulr, if it has inputs available, these inputs will be able to have their parameters set manually here. But not every node within Medulr will have input connections. So as we have now covered what an output and an input are, let's move on to the connections themselves. When you're trying to connect these nodes to one another, each connection is color-coded, be it an input or an output. And when you want to connect these outputs to an input, you will only be able to connect to a connection type of the same color. So when you drag off of an output, you'll see a connection line which shows the output connection you were using as well as which node it came from. And as for when you hover your mouse over a different node after dragging from an output, the inputs of that node will become grayed out if you're unable to connect your current output connection to it, while the ones that you can connect to will remain highlighted to show you what you can easily connect to. But that's all for how to connect your nodes to one another. Now onto a bit more of an explanation of a few of the connection types themselves. The first type of connection I will explain is our dark pink colored outputs. The only time that you will find this output is on a bitmap resource node. Bitmap resource nodes are connected to a function node as a bitmap, normal map, or bump map file, and if they aren't connected to a function node, they won't have any effect on your material. So next we have our light green colored connections. These represent a color connection, which uses the RGB values of a resource and will determine the color of a material or have the input driven by the color values. But for now, moving on to our next type of connection, what we have is a float 3. A float 3 connection uses a dark blue colored connection for its output connectors, but what exactly is a float 3? A float 3 uses 3 different values to determine the output, such as an X, Y, Z value or an RGB value. Common uses of a float 3 connection within Medulr are for things like normal maps or bump map resources. So while our next type of connection has a similar name to a float 3, they are used in very different ways. The connection that is probably used the most among materials within Medulr is a float connection. You are able to tell a float connection by its grey output color. A float connection uses one value to determine an input, and in Medulr is usually represented on a 0 to 1 decimal scale, with some cases of it being above 1. Float connections are used for many things like cutouts, transparency, roughness, specular, and glossiness. There are many different connections that are made using a float, and if you're using a resource for that float, there will usually be a grayscale image instead of in color. So next we have our orange output and input connections. What these represent are material outputs and base material inputs, and these are used when you are wanting to build onto a material, such as having a diffuse material and connecting it to a blend. The blend material will then take the previous full material into account instead of just using a singular node. So these are what you might call the most common connection types within Medulr, and although there are a few other different types of connections within Medulr, let's move on to talking about a slightly different way of making these connections. So what I'm going to talk about now is the conversions section of the node library. The reason that conversions are relevant to our connections is that it allows us to convert certain types of connections to a different output type. Therefore, in the conversion node library, you are able to convert your nodes from things like a float 3 to a float or a float 3 to a color connection. These conversion tools won't be used all that often by your average Medulr user, but will become more useful to you if you are wanting to build materials in Medulr using just functions. And now on to the last type of connection that I'll be mentioning for now, which is an IES resource connection, which can be seen as a maroon coloured output. An IES is a realistic distribution-based light which can be used as part of a material within Medulr. But as it's not a normal bitmap like most resource nodes, it has its own unique connection. This connection is only ever able to connect to an IES material node. So this is all of the types of connections that I'll be covering within this video, and hopefully there have been aspects that have helped you with understanding Medulr and the way the connections work within it. And we can't wait to see what type of materials you can create using Medulr.